On the night of June 18, 2026, Ukraine launched 19 drones at Moscow. The air defenses shot most down, but not all. A refinery burned, 4 airports shut, and President Zelensky said something that changed everything about how this war will end. I'm David, and this is where the conflict enters its most dangerous phase yet. Ukraine's drone offensive on the night of June 18th and 19th, 2026, was the largest single strike on Moscow since the invasion began. 194 drones targeted the capital. Russian officials say they intercepted most, and across all of Russia's airspace that night, 555 total were downed in 24 hours. But interception doesn't catch all debris. The Gazprom Neft refinery, which fuels Russia's military operations, was hit for the second time in 1 week. Fires tore through the complex, and wreckage fell into apartment buildings nearby. All 4 of Moscow's major airports, Sheremetyevo, Domodedovo, Vnukovsky, Chukovsky, shut down the same night. 17 people were injured, including 2 children. Ukraine's long-range drones had reached the Russian capital, and President Zelensky wanted to send a message. It is time to end this war, he said, calling the strike an entirely justified response to years of Russian bombardment on Ukrainian cities. For the first time, Moscow's military supply lines were no longer off-limits. Now Russia had to choose, accept the strike, or respond with an escalation playbook it had already tested and refined. Russia's response to Ukrainian strikes has followed a tested pattern for 2 years now. When Ukraine targets Russian infrastructure, Moscow answers with intensified drone and missile barrages against Ukrainian cities. Calculated escalation meant to degrade Ukrainian defenses and show that strikes on Russian soil carry a cost. But the pattern goes deeper. Russia has also probed NATO defenses with deliberate drone incursions. In September 2025, at least 19 Russian drones entered Polish airspace during a broader strike against Ukraine. Polish fighter jets shot down 4 of them, but debris still damaged homes and cars in eastern Poland. Then in May 2026, a Russian drone hit an apartment building in Romania, injuring 2 people. These aren't accidents, they're tests. Russia is measuring how much pressure NATO will absorb before the alliance fights back. The deeper danger is what comes next. If Russia has grown confident it can push the border without triggering a response, the next incursion might not be a probe. It might be something Russia thinks it can survive. Ukraine's logic is the inverse of Russia's cycle. Zelensky framed the strike not as aggression, but as the only response Moscow had left him. For 2 years, Russia has relentlessly bombed Ukrainian cities, schools, hospitals, apartment blocks, killing thousands of civilians. For 2 years, Ukraine's drones hit military targets on Russian soil, but avoided the capital itself, respecting a line that kept the war contained. But that restraint hasn't stopped the bombardment, it hasn't forced negotiations, so Ukraine crossed the line. The strike on Gazprom Neft and Moscow's airports sent a message. Your capital is not immune. Your population is not protected. Every missile it sends at Kyiv risks a drone arriving in Moscow. The calculus has shifted. But whether this shift actually tips the balance depends on one critical factor: whether Ukraine can replace its drones faster than Russia can replace its interceptor missiles. That's the attrition race that will determine whether Zelensky's gamble works. But here's where the math gets interesting. Russia is shooting down Ukrainian drones at extraordinary rates, 555 in one night, sometimes hundreds more per week. But every drone Ukraine loses is replaced relatively quickly. Every interceptor Russia fires is not. Military analysts tracking weapons production say Russia is consuming air defense missiles at an unsustainable rate. Each S-400 system costs Russia resources it can't easily replenish. Ukraine, meanwhile, has reverse-engineered long-range strike drones and is producing them faster than Russia can manufacture replacement interceptors. The math is brutal. If Ukraine can launch 200 drones and Russia shoots down 190, the 10 that get through cause real damage. But Russia expends 190 interceptor missiles to achieve that 95% success rate, a rate it cannot sustain indefinitely. Within months, if the pattern holds, Moscow's air defense ring around the capital will start to thin. Debris will get through. More targets will burn. Russia understands this trajectory, which is why the mood in Moscow right now is not measured. It's one of escalating urgency. The question isn't whether Russia can shoot down future drone waves. It's whether Russia will choose to escalate militarily before its defensive capacity completely erodes. The most dangerous escalation path Russia has publicly hinted at is the nuclear one. Following major Ukrainian strikes, Russian officials invoke nuclear rhetoric, warnings about Russia's strategic arsenal, reminders that Moscow has weapons the West cannot match. But here's what analysts say actually matters. Russia's will to directly engage NATO in nuclear conflict is assessed as very low. The nuclear talk is a pressure tactic, a reminder that escalation has limits. Using nuclear weapons would trigger retaliation that destroys Moscow. Russia's leaders know this. The nuclear threat is real. As a lever, it shapes every Western decision on weapons transfers and aid. But nuclear weapons aren't a pathway to Russian victory. They're a guarantee of Russian destruction. So Russia must choose between accepting ongoing strikes on Moscow or attempting something it has never done: direct military confrontation with NATO. For now, the nuclear option remains purely rhetorical. The real escalation pressure is building elsewhere. In the attrition math of air defenses running dry, in the proximity of Russian and NATO forces along a border that keeps shifting. See those arrows crossing the border? Russian drones entering NATO airspace. Poland, September 2025, 19 drones. Romania, May 2026. One hit an apartment building. These are deliberate probes, not stray missiles. Russia is testing how far it can push the alliance's air defenses before NATO decides to push back. The line between testing and triggering is getting dangerously thin. Every incident makes the next escalation more likely, not less. But Ukraine's strategy depends on more than military attrition. Repeated strikes on Gazprom Neft and other refineries aim at economic pressure. Each fire raises Russia's production costs, disrupts fuel exports, strains the military budget. In the short term, it works. Russia's energy sector is under strain, revenues are down. But here's the limiting factor. Current damage isn't enough to cripple Russia's energy sector entirely. Russia still exports oil through Kazakhstan, Belarus, and Central Asia. India and China still buy at a discount. Pressure isn't collapse. Ukraine's strikes are raising the cost of war, but not yet making war impossible. This is the core tension in Ukraine's new strategy. Can sustained economic pressure force Moscow to negotiate? Or will Russia absorb the pain and outlast the West's support? The answer determines whether this strike on Moscow marks the beginning of a negotiated endgame or simply another rung on an escalating ladder. To understand what might happen next, history offers a guide and a warning. Capital city strikes have always been pivotal moments in warfare. During World War II, the Blitz on London killed 40,000 people but didn't break British morale. It steeled the population against surrender. But when Berlin fell to Soviet forces in 1945, civilian death tolls mounted as the city burned and the German government sought surrender. The difference between those outcomes wasn't the damage, it was how the political leadership read the strike. Did they see it as survivable or existential? In Ukraine's case, Zelensky is betting that Moscow will read the strike on the capital as a signal. Escalation will be mutual, costs will keep rising, and surrender is better than the alternative. But Moscow's reading might be different. Putin might see the strike as proof that the West, through Ukraine's drones, is waging direct war on Russia, requiring an escalatory response. History shows that these moments of interpretation are unstable. The same strike can trigger negotiation in one context and all-out war in another. What matters is what Russia chooses to see and what it decides to do next. President Zelensky's declaration, "It is time to end this war," marks a threshold Ukraine has crossed. The June strike on Moscow signals not a one-time attack, but a sustained campaign. Moscow's air defenses cannot sustain current loss rates. Russia's economy is under strain. NATO's borders are increasingly tested by Russian probes. None of this forces Russian surrender, but together they create mounting pressure. Russia now faces a choice it has been avoiding: accept ongoing strikes on its own territory and population, or escalate militarily in a way that could trigger direct NATO involvement, a risk Moscow has calculated it cannot survive. Zelensky is betting that Russia will choose absorption over escalation, that the cost of continuing the war will eventually exceed Putin's appetite for it. But Putin might call that bluff. He might decide that escalation, cyber attacks on NATO infrastructure, more aggressive border probes, even chemical or biological strikes on Ukrainian territory, is worth the risk. What neither side knows is where the breaking point actually lies. This strike on Moscow didn't end the war, but it may have eliminated the option of backing down without losing everything. And that's when wars become most dangerous, not because either side wants escalation, but because both have too much invested in continuing. Moscow and Kyiv are now locked in a spiral neither can reverse. Like and subscribe to stay on top of the world's highest stakes standoffs. I'm David. See you next time.